Hello, class. This week is week 2, and we will be studying 3 ethical theories. The 3 that we will be studying are rational ethical egoism, deontology, and utilitarianism. This may require more than one video just because of length constraints on videos, so if you see 2 videos, watch them both. So here we go. Let's just start right now with ethical egoism. So ethical egoism. Under this theory, morality involves the pursuit of our rational self-interest. This theory is only concerned with a person's best interest. Now, it's not the same as ethical subjectivism, wherein what someone believes is right for them is right morally. It's not like that at all. It has to do with our rational self-interest based on reason, not just what we want or what we believe. So, ethical egoism also holds that the world itself would be a happier, better place if we all pursued our rational self-interests. So the ethical philosopher that we have excerpted from in our book, whom you'll read too, is Ayn Rand. She held that under this theory of rational ethical egoism, that humans are rational and fundamentally solitary individuals. We each pursue our own self-interest. Under this theory, it is important that we use reason to determine what is best for self. So in order to get something, in return for what is deserved, there's something called a principle of trade. We should only do something for someone else if we get something of similar value in return. Think about trading like at the market and in days long ago before they had cash, that sort of thing. That sort of idea, principle of trade. That's the way you get something in return that is deserved. If you don't do that, we'll get to that later. Why under Ayn Rand's philosophy, that's bad, that's immoral. So, under rational ethical egoism, if we all participate in our own rational self-interest, we promote the common good. And the danger with not pursuing our rational self-interest and only giving something to someone if we get something back, that principle of trade, one of the pitfalls is altruism. Under rational ethical egoism, altruism is a vice. That is doing something for someone without any expectation of reward without anything back. According to Ayn Rand, she believed it was wrong to give things to people who have not earned or deserved them. And they become parasites, right? And you're going to see exactly how she articulates that in her excerpt that we have in our book. So, under rational ethical egoism as well, the sole purpose of government is to protect our individual rights to pursue our rational self-interests. So, as you can imagine, this theory has many deficiencies. First of all, it's one of the strengths is it's important to understand that we all want to be happy. Pursuing our own interests is important to our happiness. Absolutely, that's really wonderful. But it imagines us living as if we were disconnected from larger relationships around us. And if we focus only on our own happiness, we wind up feeling frustrated and alienated, right? So just engaging in self-actualization, making ourselves better, etc., etc., is not always associated with increased happiness. So this is what we call the hedonist paradox, right? Also, if there's conflicts between people, there's no guidelines for resolving these conflicts because someone may believe they're acting in their self-interest, rational self-interest. Another person may believe they're acting in their self-interest, but sometimes these interests conflict with each other. There's no real guidelines and a moral basis to be able to resolve these conflicts because they're both under rational ethical egoism are doing the right thing. So, so that's pretty much rational ethical egoism summarized. Also, another thing too that's important to think about, like this theory globally, if we apply it globally, particularly with regard to limited resources and stuff like that along that lines. Those basically who will usually get more are those that really have stuff already. They have the ability to acquire more, etc. Those who are disadvantaged, who do not have the ability to actualize their self-interest, are going to always be disadvantaged, right? So this applies to like people as well as groups and countries. So this is a theory that has several deficiencies, as you'll see as you do your reading. The second theory that you will learn about in our book is utilitarianism. Utilitarian theory was developed by an English philosopher and reformer, Jeremy Bentham. He developed this philosophy in response to injustices that he saw during an industrial revolution in England. So the morality of, under utilitarianism, the morality of an action or a policy is determined solely by its consequences. You'll see in other places where this may be called a consequentialist theory. So it's important to understand the consequences that result from an action that we undertake or a policy that we institute or some kind of practice that we follow. The morality of the action or policy is determined solely by the consequences. Under this theory, the desire for happiness is universal, and we should recognize it as the greatest good on an intuitive basis. Hallmark of utilitarian theory is what's called the principle of utility, or the greatest happiness principle, wherein actions are right in proportion to as they tend to promote happiness, and wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. So the greatest happiness principle, in other words, the happier people are, the better it is, or the more people that are happy, the better it is, basically. So that's something to keep in mind. Under utilitarian theory, and this was very important, like historically during certain movements in Europe and in the United States, the idea of equality and partiality are also stressed, like treating everyone equally and impartially. Very important under utilitarianism. With regard to the idea of pleasures, there were two philosophers that were from whom you're going to have excerpts, Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. They disagreed on the nature of the pleasures that should be considered important. For Jeremy Bentham, he was very impartial, like very much about equality. He said that all pleasures are equal. The happiness of any one being is no more or less important than any other being. So this is something we can extend to with regard to like animal rights, for instance. The pleasures of an animal are just as important. The happiness of an animal is just as important as the happiness of a human being. So this philosophy has been used to argue for the ethical treatment of animals, say for instance, and to stop policies such as animal testing of products on animals. John Stuart Mill had a different approach with regard to utilitarianism. He believed that intellectual pleasures are qualitatively more important than simple pleasures of the body. So those animals, as such as humans, that have the ability to reason, their happiness should be given more weight, taken more consideration to. So there's a difference between John Stuart Mill and Bentham on that note. And with regard to utilitarianism, when we approach moral dilemmas, it is important to engage in like a bottom-up approach. It begins with the understanding the actual happiness of sentient beings that have feeling of, pain and pleasure, rather than imposing morality and social ideas on them from above. So it's not a really idealistic, or how shall you say, principled moral theory. It has to do with the pains and pleasures that people may experience with regard to this on the bottom level, and then from examining that on the bottom, we work our way up and develop policy that's utilitarian and that creates the greatest happiness for the most people. Under utilitarianism, it requires that we examine our position on moral issues in light of the actual consequences of our actions and policies, and we have to do our research. So we must balance, with regard to a policy or an action, the the harms it may cause and the benefits it may cause, and really do our research and look at this before we can institute a policy, put a law into practice, etc. And here's how we do this through what's called the utilitarian calculus. There are 7 principles by which we can examine the morality of an action, or not principles so much as qualities. So under utilitarian calculus, we can examine the intensity of the pleasure and pain, so its strength, the strength of the pleasure and pain that will be generated. We should also look at the duration of the pain or pleasure, the length of time that the pleasure or pain will last, the certainty of the pleasure or pain, the level of probability that the pleasure or pain will occur. Propinquity, which is an interesting word. Propinquity is how near in time the pain or pleasure will occur. So if it's nearer in time, that may form part of our calculus, as that's a good thing. Then maybe we should institute that policy. If it's very far away, that's something we should take into consideration, that maybe we should take a different approach, right? The next one is fecundity. We often see this in terms of fertility. So the fecundity means that the extent to which the pleasure will produce more pleasure. So that will be important. We'll be able to generate this policy action, whatever generate more pleasure in the long run. Purity. The pleasure will not cause pain at the same time. So we want to examine whether our actions, policies will create a more purely beneficial, happy environment, right? The last one is the extent. And this is a very important part of the utilitarian calculus, the number of sentient beings that are affected by the action, the number of people who are affected, and also the happiness that is engendered. So it's the utilitarian theory has some strengths and it has some limitations. Some of its strengths are it challenges to rethink traditional notions about moral community. Who is that community of people to which we have obligations, moral obligations? For animal rights activists, they would tend to include non-human animals into that moral community, etc., because pleasures of humans and animals should be equal, according to the Bentham approach, not so much John Stuart Mill. One of the strengths and also one of the weaknesses is insistence on impartiality and equality and utilitarian theory. That can be problematic when we talk about the theory of justice under John Rawls, which we'll talk about in our next video. So there are also other desirable goals in life between pleasure. That's another consequence. By claiming that only consequences count, under utilitarian theory, we often underplay the importance of individual integrity and personal responsibility by just looking at consequences. Also, under utilitarian theory, we may run the risk of using people as a means toward the end of pleasure. Pleasures being, under utilitarian theory, the end, the important end, right? We may use people as a means toward that end. We'll see, studying under deontology, that can be very problematic, because we should never use people as ends in themselves. We should never use people as ends towards a goal. So we should always consider people as ends in themselves, which we'll study a little bit further when we study deontology. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop this video now. We're going to have our second video for this week on deontology. And so that's it. That's it for this video. And thank you. Go on to the next video.